So this week we're going back inside the ear, so we're going back into the structures of the inner ear, and we're going to look at the anatomy responsible for the vestibular system. That is the part of the inner ear that contribute towards balance, detection of gravity and movement and stuff like that, right? Again, it's tiny, there's lots of details in there, there's lots of things people get tripped up on, but I think the biggest thing for most people is that we know about the semicircular canals, but in fact there are not just the 3 semicircular canals, there are 5 organs within the inner ear responsible for contributing to the vestibular system. So what do I mean by the vestibular system? Well, I mean the organs inside the inner ear, these guys again, and we'll have a little reminder of where exactly that is, that detect rotational movements of the head, also detect gravity and movement, what have you. And those movements get added to the input coming from the proprioception parts of the nervous system, and all added together, and the brain uses that to help us with balance and perception of the world moving around us. The other interesting thing about the vestibular system is that it's wired into the movements of the eyes. So it's very easy, isn't it, to move your head but keep your eyes tracking on something that you're looking at. And that's really important, because in the eye you've got the fovea, you've got a part of the retina that's very good at high resolution detail, but everything around here is a bit blurry. So when you're looking at something, you've really got to look at something. And yet, of course, your head tilts and moves and that sort of thing, and particularly if you're moving as well, the vestibular system, right, takes all of these movements and smooths it out for your eyeballs, so you keep looking at what you're looking at. It's very cool, the vestibular ocular reflex. And we looked at the muscles that move the eye back in one of the eye videos. We're going to have a look at one of those. That's important, because if we talk about the structures at the end, we'll go back to what happens when these things go wrong, vertigo, right? But with vertigo, we see flicking of the eyes. Okay then, so a little reminder, here is the ear. This is the right ear. This is the right ear. This is the bone behind the ear. So this is the temporal region. This is the temporal bone. And on the other side of the ear, we've got the ear canal, right? Sound goes in there. We've already looked at the tympanic membrane and the ossicles and things like that. And we also talked about the cochlea. So if this is the external ear, the tympanic cavity in there is the middle ear, then these structures within their bony case in there, these are the structures of the inner ear. And the cochlea and the vestibular apparatus are all joined up and linked and sat there together within the bone. So they've got this single nerve. Cranial nerve 8, the vestibular cochlear nerve, carrying sensory information back from the ear and from the vestibular apparatus. And in fact, sending some information back to the cochlea. But anyway, right. So this lumpy bit of bone here is, right, there's the external acoustic meatus, there's the external acoustic meatus. Take the top off the skull, right, and then we've got this petrous lump of bone in here. This is the petrous part of the temporal bone, petrous because it's rocky, this rocky ridge, and inside there we've got the structures of the inner ear. Right, while we're furrowing around here, let's do a bit of terminology. Otic means ear, hence the parotid gland is beside the ear, so it gets called the paraotic gland or parotid gland. But this petrous part of the temporal bone, it's got like an extra layer of harder, denser bone within it, which gets called the otic capsule, which is a bit of a weird concept to try to get to grips with. But we've got the otic capsule, then essentially inside the otic capsule, see, that might be the otic capsule, you've then got the bony labyrinth. If I pop this out, so what we're looking at here, these are the hard parts of the cochlea and the semicircular canals and what have you. This would be the bony labyrinth. And inside there, if we could take these apart, like the cochlea just fell apart, inside the bony labyrinth is a space. And then that space is divided up by connective tissues, by membranes. So the space inside the membranes gets called the membranous labyrinth, and the space inside the bony bits gets called the bony labyrinth. Does that make sense? And then we have this fluid, perilymph, between the bone and the membranes. Peri on the outer side, the perilymph. The perilymph is very much like cerebrospinal fluid. In fact, I think it links to the CSF somewhere. So the endolymph is within the membranous labyrinth, and the hair cells responsible for detecting movements and sound are within the membranous labyrinth, and they're bathed in endolymph then, and the endolymph is high in potassium ions. And what happens with the hair cells is that, why we call them hair cells is they're cells that look like they've got hairs. Now the hairs sticking out the hair cells get called cilia. Really, they're a bit different to cilia. They're not like the brush border of cilia we have in the airways. These are a stereocilia. They're a bit more like specialized microvilli. Microvilli being cell membrane folded that we see in the gut. Anyway, so the stereocilia, the hairs on the hair cells, when they get deflected, they cause either repolarization or depolarization. So the high concentration of potassium ions in the endolymph enables this, and then, depending on whatever the hair cell's job is, when it deflects, it then causes an action potential. Neuroscience, magic happens, right? And the thing was supposed to be recognized by the brain gets recognized by the brain. Anyway, that's why endolymph is different to perilymph, and that's why that's important. If you didn't have, so if the endolymph and the perilymph mixes, the hair cells don't work anymore. Okay, how are you doing so far? Bony labyrinth, membranous labyrinth, endolymph is the important one. Now I said there are 5 parts to the vestibular apparatus. We'll do the 3 semicircular canals last. First of all, we'll do these 2 guys. So if these are the semicircular canals and this is the cochlea, down here we've got 2 very difficult spaces to see. These are the otolith organs, the utricle and the saccule. And the job of the utricle and the saccule are to detect linear movements and detect gravity. So the utricle detects horizontal movements and the saccule detects vertical movements, right? Hence why they get called gravity detectors, detectors of acceleration and things like that. And what's happening is we've got hair cells in here and we've got endolymph, and both of these 2 otolith organs, they look like they're both horizontal, but it's not the direction of the organ that's important, it's the direction of the hair cells, right? So if the hair cells are in this direction, they'll get deflected when you do that. If the hair cells are in this direction, they'll get deflected when you do that. Do you see? So it's these 2 spaces here, and you've got to remember that these aren't really enclosed spaces. The fluid can flow around these endolymph spaces. Now the utricle is closer to the semicircular canals and the saccule is closer to the cochlea. But otherwise that's the only real way of remembering these 2 apart from one another. So these 2 membranous spaces, or membranous organs, the utricle and the saccule then, they're within the membranous labyrinth, and they're both within the bony space of the vestibule. So the vestibule, recognize the word vestibule, right? The vestibule then is part of the bony labyrinth. Now one thing I find very confusing in illustrations in textbooks, there are often labels for saccule and utricle and macula. You think, what's the macula? Now, what they really should label is everything separately. The macula, that's the organ with the hair cells that get deflected. So there's a macula in the saccule and there's a macula in the utricle. I know, it's a lot of words, but if we label everything, hopefully it's clearer. So think of those 2 different organs as 2 separate organs, and those are the otolith organs. Now the cool thing about the otolith organs, the way they work is very, very cool, but the way they work can also cause problems, and they're causing problems in one of my ears. Now, When we looked at the cochlea, we saw that the hair cells aren't just hair cells in fluid that bend, but in fact, the cells are on a basement membrane, and then the hairs stick up into another membrane. And what really happens is the membrane gets deflected, and that's what bends the hair cells. Now, in the hair cells of the utricle and the saccule, we have this gelatinous otolith membrane. Now, the clever thing is that it's not just a normal membrane. In this membrane, there are calcium carbonate crystals, like grains of calcium carbonate. And what that does is that increases the mass and the density of the otolith membrane, right? So because the hair cells can move, and this is all floating in endolymph, when you move from side to side, or you go up and down with sense acceleration, most of the utricle and the saccule moves with the bone because it's anchored to the bone, but that gelatinous otolith membrane is a bit more free floating. And because it's got mass, it lags behind, right? So, get it? Isn't that clever? Now the problem is when those calcium carbonate crystals get out of that membrane and then they start floating around in the endolymph, and if they're big enough, they might get stuck and cause problems. Okay, so those are the otolith organs. To be honest, I don't think those mechanisms of hair cell deflection are as well understood as they are in the cochlea. I think the cochlea has been studied a bit more for good reason. Now, the semicircular canals. So there are 3 semicircular canals, and I think the most beautiful thing is how these 3 semicircular canals are at right angles to one another. Now, they're not sat inside the skull in those perfect planes. They're at a bit of an angle, but isn't it amazing how we've got these three hoops, these 3 rings at 90 degrees to one another? If you were trying to build something to do this job, that's how you'd build it, but this is just evolved like this. Amazing. If I put this back into the ear then, okay, so there's the ear, right? So the ear is kind of flat like that. Can you see how there's a little bit of a, right, if the ear's kind of sitting like that, this whole thing is at a bit of an angle. So can you see how the semicircular canals are at a bit of an angle? They're not perfectly square on to like the sagittal and coronal planes. They're a little bit twisted. And of course, if we look inside the skull at the petrous part of the temporal bone, you can see how that's running at an angle, mimicking what I was showing you here, right? So, just that idea that they're not like perfectly like this and this and this, which is probably how I build it. They're a bit of an angle, but also we have semicircular canals. The whole vestibular apparatus is on both sides of the body. You know, I reckon if you were building this, you'd probably just bother with one of them, but we're symmetrical organisms, so we've got 2. The brain then, for all of these movements, isn't just receiving the information from the vestibular apparatus on one side, it's taking the information from both sides and pulling it all together and working out what's going on, right? So never forget that both sides add up. It's not just one side working on its own. Now, so the semicircular canals then, the 3 of them, so the semicircular canals, the canals are the bony labyrinth, these bony shapes that we see here. And we have anterior, posterior and horizontal, because it's running horizontally. Now, inside the bony labyrinth we have perilymph, but inside the bony labyrinth we then have a membranous duct. So there's a membranous tube within the semicircular canal. That tube, that membranous tube, gets called the semicircular duct. So if you come across those terms and wonder what the difference is, that's what the difference is. That's what we're seeing here in the grey. Oh God, there goes the cochlea again. So the white bone is the canal, and here the canal has been opened and we can see the grey membranous semicircular duct. And again, at the end of each duct we can see an opening, an ampulla. So the purpose of these 3 semicircular ducts is to detect rotational movements of the head. So nodding, shaking your head, and tilting your head from side to side. So these are on those then the three axes, like I say, both sides add up. So you can work out what's going on from each. So this is anterior and posterior then. You can see that the anterior semicircular canal, the lateral or inferior semicircular canal, and the posterior semicircular canal. And what's happening when you do that is that the endolymph within the semicircular canal swishes from side to side. Now, if you've got a cup of tea, and you've always got a cup of tea with you, right? When you're learning, the cup of tea, right? The outside of the cup of tea, the mug, would be kind of the semicircular duct, the walls of the duct, and then the tea is the endolymph, is the fluid inside. And as you then turn the cup, the fluid doesn't go with the cup, does it, right? It just, the bone turns, then the fluid kind of stays where it is, moves a little bit. Now, if you were to keep moving the cup, eventually the fluid would start moving, right? And that's what happens in the semicircular canals, essentially. As you move your head from side to side, this is why you get dizzy, right? The bone and the membranes move with your head, the fluid kind of stays where it is. And as the fluid stays where it is, but the bone moves, and the membranes move, and the hair cells are attached to the membranes, the hair cells deflect because the fluid stays where it is, but the hair cells move. Does that make sense? We've got the same principle as we've seen elsewhere with these hair cells. Each semicircular canal has got a widening, an ampulla, and within the ampulla there is the ampullary crest, crista ampullaris, I think is its Latin name, and that is the organ with the hair cells in the semicircular canals, the crista ampullaris. So the hair cells, again, they're on a membrane, they're stuck, and then the hair cells aren't free floating as you might have been led to believe in the past. They're sat in another membrane, the cupula, in the semicircular canals, so that as the cupula deflects, it's actually the cupula that deflects. So as you rotate your head, I say the fluid stays where it is, and your coffee cup moves around it, or your semicircular canal moves around the fluid, and then that juxtaposition of stationary fluid and moving membrane causes the cupula to deflect, which is what really bends the hair cells and causes depolarization and repolarization and action potentials and magic. So why do you, sorry fella, I haven't done a health and safety form for this, don't tell anybody. So what happens when you keep spinning around and around and around then? Well, oh God. Of course, what normally happens is, because you don't normally spin around and around and around, what normally happens is you just turn your head and turn it back again. What's happening in my semicircular canals now is that the fluid is also moving, and the membranous labyrinth, the membranous semicircular canal, semicircular, this is really hard when you're dizzy, is moving. And now I'm really quite dizzy, right? Everything's sloshing around, the hair cells are just constantly bent, they don't know what's going on, and I don't feel too good. So when I stop, I'm very dizzy, I don't feel like I've stopped. Are my eyes flickering? Am I getting nystagmus? And now it's easing off, it's getting better, it's getting better. So what's happening when I'm dizzy is the fluid has kept moving. The semicircular duct has stopped moving, the fluid is still going around that semicircular duct, so the hair cells are going, whee, you're still moving. So it feels like I'm still moving even though I'm not. And then eventually with friction, ooh, that flow of semicircular, it's slowed down and stopped now. And the endolymph now has stopped flowing, the bony labyrinth is not moving, I'm no longer dizzy. Ooh, which is why if you do go around one way, and you get dizzy, going back around the other way switches off the dizzy, because the fluid gets going and then you can get the fluid going the other way and make it stop faster. Cool, huh? Experiments in the anatomy lab. See, it's not too bad, is it? You've got the cochlea, which we looked at another week, and then we have the utricle and the saccule, the two otolith organs, and then we have the three semicircular canals, The principle for all of these things is the same, is we have hair cells embedded in a membrane, and we have endolymph, and then movement moves the endolymph, which causes the membrane to move, to deflect, which then bends the hair cells, and depending upon where the hair cells are, in which direction they've been oriented, and that's the real reason for these bony spaces, is to put hair cells in different directions, or to get endolymph to flow in different directions when you do different movements. When those hair cells just of that part deflect, they then trigger action potentials, tell the brain this is happening, and the brain works out what's going on. So, what happens with vertigo then? I was talking about those calcium carbonate crystals. So those crystals in the membrane of the otolith organs, which gives it weight, if those crystals slip out of there, because all of this is interconnected, if the crystal slips out, it's not a big deal, but if it slips into one of the semicircular ducts and is big enough, it's then going to impede flow of fluid around that semicircular duct, right? And if you impede the flow, and of course you've got two organs, one on either side, so if you do that and one organ says that, yeah, you're tilting your head, the other organ says, nah, you're not tilting your head, the brain gets confused and you start to feel a bit, whoa, you get the dizziness. So vertigo is a sense that you're moving when you're not really moving, or a sense that an object or stuff around you is moving when it's not really moving. That's vertigo. And it's because one of these things is not working properly. So benign positional vertigo is what I get. I think I've got it in my right ear, just in one of these semicircular canals. So it's like if I put my head down just like that way, or like that, ooh, that was it. If I get it in just the right position, I start to get a bit of vertigo and I start to get dizzy. When it kicks off and it's full on vertigo, it's horrible. You can't even tilt your head, you get nausea, you feel terribly sick. The whole world's moving, you've got no balance, walking's very difficult. You can actually get somebody to put you in a series of movements for a certain amount of time, which gets the stone to slip out of the semicircular canal, and Gareth does that for me. I don't have anything too bad these days, but so that's the calcium carbonate crystals from the otolith organs slipping into the semicircular canals. Motion sickness is a similar thing, where you get a disconnect between the information that's coming in through your retina about the world around you and the vestibular system telling you about how you're moving in the world around you. When those two get disconnected, you get motion sick, like when you're reading on a very bumpy journey. And worst of all, labyrinthitis, which is probably caused by a viral infection of these spaces, but nobody's entirely sure, which disrupts their function. Labyrinthitis is horrific and makes you feel awful and can last a lot longer than something like BPPV, which tends to wear off quite quickly. Now the nystagmus, like I said, the eye flicking, so because you've got that vestibulo-ocular link, so the brain normally will keep your eyes focused on whatever you're looking at because it knows how you move in your head because of all this sensory information that's coming in. If those two get broken down, so if I've got BPPV and one of my inner ears thinks that my head is rotating when it's not, then it'll flick my eyes to try to keep up with the object that it thinks it's, because it thinks my head is moving but it's not. So nystagmus, that eye flicking, is a really good indicator of vertigo. Anyway, that's it. Hopefully that wasn't too bad. I think we've done most of the ear now, haven't we? So we've done the vestibular apparatus, the cochlear apparatus, so that's the inner ear. We've done the tympanic membrane, the external ear. That's the ear. It's a very complicated thing. And of course, this is a really, really big model. All of these structures we've been talking about are absolutely tiny, which is why those little deflections in fluid and hair cells can have such a big effect on us. All right. Don't know what we're going to do next week, but no doubt it'll be fun. See you next week.